So this lesson is going to be on human resources, and similar to a lot of the other lessons that we've had, this is going to be more of a high level overview where I want you to understand what sort of requirements there are, as well as some of the specifics regarding some of the laws. But in reality, most of the time, if you were going to be dealing with these, you would have some form of support from your human resources department, or if you're working for a smaller organization, there are human resource departments that do like just advisory stuff. And so that would be with all of the requirements and everything, that'd be a good investment if you don't have the ability to have a full-time human resources manager. Anyway, so let's go ahead and get started with our lesson. So when we look at human resources, this is really everything that has to do with the use of human capital, from recruiting to performance evaluations and all of the very specific protection laws that have come about over the years with regards to the protection of people from potential exploitations. And so, as you'll see, the size of the organization is going to be crucial into how many, or to how these human resources policies and laws need to be implemented, with larger organizations having more requirements. But it's important that we understand basically this overall process of dealing with employees. So when we look at employment laws, we're looking at laws that govern this entire process of them working for our organization. And then these laws also have created what we call protected classes. And so when we look at most employment laws, it is anti-discrimination laws that we're talking about. And so these anti-discrimination laws come from these protected classes. And these protected classes may vary a little bit from state to state, but we have federally protected classes, and then some states have added additional protected classes. And what a protected class basically means is it is against the law to discriminate based off of membership in one of these protected classes. And so when you think of discrimination, you need to think just literally from the standpoint of consideration. It is illegal to even consider them being a part of these protected classes during those job requirements. And the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, is the federally created agency that's responsible for enforcing these guidelines. And so there are a whole lot of guidelines and rules associated with protected classes and a lot of resources. So everywhere throughout the entire process, from job descriptions to interviewing, there are all these guidelines and rules that it's important to understand and be aware of. So there is one exception to these anti-discrimination laws, and that is a bona fide occupational qualification. So there is an opportunity to be able to discriminate based on one of these protected classes. But in order to do that, you have to have a very specific reason why someone would not be able to perform those duties. So the example here, right? A woman is applied for a job in a prison, but her application was declined. Is this gender discrimination? And that really depends. And it depends on what the job is and what the qualifications really are for that. So, for example, if the reason that they were going to discriminate was because they felt that a woman would not be able to um, perform the job duties as far as being able to physically restrain a male inmate or something of that notion, then it actually would be discrimination, because it's not the fact that it's male female that's really necessary. It's the ability to physically restrain an individual. So you can have a requirement in there that says you would be able to physically restrain, and this is where oftentimes you see things like in job descriptions, like must be able to lift 50 pounds. If you are a stalker at a grocery store, you can discriminate against people that are unable to perform that duty, right? And so that is the bona fide occupational qualification. But in a situation where, like, maybe it is a all male prison and you're hiring for a drug testing coordinator, and the large portion of their job is to witness drug tests, right? In that case, you would need a male to administer drug tests with males. So in athletic training, we see this come up a little bit with the possibility of single-use locker rooms. And depending on the size of the organization, it will depend on whether or not that organization would be able to discriminate based off of their facilities or would need to make accommodations. Most of the time, the organizations are big enough that a athletic training room in a locker room, or that you could only access from a locker room, would be considered something that needs to be accommodated, not something you could discriminate for. Table 4.1 here talks and shows a lot of the different federal laws that have been enacted to create some of these protected classes, as well as govern who must comply with them. There are some differences with this. So what I want you to do is be able to identify, these laws based on the chart. So what is the purpose of the law? Whom does it protect? Link that with the name of the law. And so you should spend some time studying this chart as well. One thing to just touch on briefly, because it gets a lot of attention normally, is sexual harassment. And part of human resources is that you do have a requirement to protect your employees from different types of harassment and abuse. Sexual harassment being one of the most common with that. There are different types. The quid pro quo is the most obvious type, where basically this is the this for that. You expect within the organization there's an expectation of sexual favors or sexual content for promotion or retention. But more commonly is this idea of a hostile work environment where you have repetitive sexual discrimination, or that creates a hostile work environment for an average individual. And so you've spent some time being educated with that in a variety of different things. So I'm not going to go into too much more depth than just that, but understand that sexual harassment becomes a large portion of human resource management. The recruitment process. So going through some of these specific components within human resources, we'll start with recruitment. And when it comes to recruitment and looking to hire an individual, this is where a lot of planning needs to come into place to make sure you're in compliance with all of these appropriate labor laws. From there, the best way to enable you to hire and to have a successful search process is to spend a lot of time on this position description. This should describe exactly what the hiring criteria is going to be, as well as then the job duties. And so from there, you would be able to benchmark their performance based off of this position description. At that same note, being able, when you're looking to accept a job, understanding the position description is important, because that's what you're going to be judged off of, and making sure that there are no surprises there. So we talked about, or I hinted about this idea with different sizes of organizations. Here's a chart specifically talking about that. These are the laws associated with that previous chart. And you can see now how large organizations need to be in order to comply with these different rules. And the idea with this is that smaller organizations are less able to make reasonable accommodations. And so they've set these benchmarks where if you have more than these number of employees, you must comply with these laws, which is important to be considered when you're recruiting. After recruiting usually gets into an interview process, whether in person or online or on the phone, and there are different components with that. I'm not going to really get into all of that. The textbook does a good job of explaining some of the different components within the interview process and all that. I'm specifically going to talk more in general on things that you need to be prepared for, as well as how you can go about interviewing individuals if you were in that position. And really it comes down to the different types of questions, right? Theoretical, leading, closed end, open end, all these sorts of aspects. Really it comes down to the idea that you want to use open-ended questions as much as possible. Theoretical questions really has a better chance of them able to, or it really reflects more on their ability to answer questions opposed to what they're actually able to do a good job with. And you really want open-ended questions that ask for them to tell stories about previous experiences. And at that same note, if you're asked an open-ended question, the best way for you to describe yourself is to tell that story of a time that you've already done it. That leads to a good understanding of what you would be doing in the future. As far as legal and illegal questions, right, this comes down to the protected classes situations, where you cannot ask about anything within that protected class. There can be, however, some ways that you can do this to get information that you would need for that bona fide occupational qualification. Like, you can't ask how old somebody is, because that gives the possibility of age discrimination, but you can ask if they are over the age of 18, if that's a requirement for the position. On that same note here, looking at some of these personals, are you able to lift 50 pounds, right, and carry it 100 yards? Right? You can ask something like that, but asking how you weigh or your overall fitness is not appropriate. And so take a look at each of these different things within this box, so you have an understanding of legal and illegal questions with that. Moving on to then, once the hiring is extended and an offer is extended, there's usually the salary and compensation and benefits package that then is offered, right? And this is where it's important to not only understand the value of salary, but of benefits. And when we're talking about benefits, this is anything in addition beyond normal salary. And so some things to consider are, the health insurance and how much that is going to cost you compared to compared to what the employer is paying. Obviously, if you are expected to contribute more, or if you do not get health coverage, then your salary is actually lower because you have to pay into that. And it's even worse because you have to pay taxes and all sorts of crazy stuff with that. But also 401ks and retirement plans, and whether or not there's a matching component with that. Oftentimes, employers of larger organizations will offer a matching plan to your 401k, so you contribute into your retirement account, and your employer matches it, which is basically free money, right? It's tax-free income that you can't access until retirement. But if you're not fully participating in your 401k, then you are literally giving away money. And so that's something to consider as well. Not only do they offer 401ks and retirement matching, but if you are working at a place and they're doing it, you really need to be participating in that. And then there are all sorts of other sorts of perks and different things with that. Everything from daycare, time off, sick days. But in our area, right, payment for memberships and licensing dues and CEU reimbursement, right? These are expenses that you're going to have to incur. You pay at minimum about $150 just to maintain your license. That doesn't every year, right? You have to pay that to the Board of Certification. That doesn't include any of your CEUs that included. So these are costs that are associated with maintaining your credential, right? That's just part of being an employee. It's your job to maintain your qualifications. But oftentimes employers will contribute to that as well. And that is something to be considered when you're looking at job opportunities, or for you to advocate for when you're hiring. Most of the time, these compensations and benefits are not very negotiable. With that, normally salary is your main negotiable thing, but payment of licensing and CEUs is one thing that you can and should ask about when you're accepting offers. A special thing to consider with that when we're talking about offers, this idea of exempt and non-exempt, and these are exempt from the federal minimum wage and overtime laws, right? So an exempt person is exempt from overtime laws. These are considered salary positions, right? They must be salary, and they need to be professional in nature. And so athletic training would fall into the exempt category on most cases because of the professional nature of the job, meaning that it can be done with a certain amount of autonomy. And so the ability to control the schedule and dictate that is appropriate. However, with that, there is also this requirement that you need to be paid a federally minimum set amount annually. And that number changes recently all over the time with current rules associated with different administrations. And so that number has ranged anywhere from, in the low 30s to the mid 40s with that. And so that's something to consider if you're hiring individuals. If you're paying below that set federal minimum, you are not allowed to give somebody a salaried exempt position, right? They are required to be eligible for overtime rules, meaning if they work more than 40 hours in a week, then they would be required to get paid time and a half for that. And at that same note, it's also important to consider when you're hiring with these non-exempt employees that if they are required to do activities in which they are not reimbursed, that is actually a violation as well. So if they're returning emails or phone calls or whatever and they're not on the clock, and that's accepted, even if the individual is willingly doing it, that is a violation of these federal laws. And so when it gets down to that in the hiring, making an offer, most of these are contingent upon reference checks or background checks and possibly a physical or drug test. And all of these need to be done in written form to limit confusion with that. So you should always try to get a written offer. And then the last part of this is obviously the performance appraisal process. And this is a fairly complicated thing all the way around, but it's important that if you are in a management position, that you are using the performance appraisal process to evaluate the employee's ability to fulfill their job description. And if they are not doing that, you need to employ this idea of progressive discipline, where you give warnings, different aspects, performance improvement plans with that, so that if there is a need to terminate an individual, there has been an opportunity for that individual to improve. Otherwise, wrongful termination lawsuits can follow easily. So there's a lot more of that within your textbook as far as good examples and good practices, but understanding that performance appraisal process is important if you are a manager. And so that's the end of the human resources component. As always, if you have questions or anything, otherwise, have a great day.